For Crema Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dhlamini. Professor Piero Gleijeses joins me to discuss relations between Cuba and Southern Africa. Professor, your book titled Visions of Freedom, Havana, Washington, Pretoria, and the Struggle for Southern Africa, 1976 to 1991, tells a remarkable and sweeping history of Cuba's role in assisting Southern African liberation movements in their fights for freedom. Tell us in what ways Cuba showed solidarity with freedom fighters from this region.
Well, Cuba had already been giving aid to South Africa, to a liberation movement from Southern Africa before 1975, including the ANC. But a moment in which Cuba changed the history of Southern Africa is in 1975. In 1975, Angola is moving towards decolonization. It's supposed to be independent on November 11, 1975. And in the spring of 1975, you have a civil war that begins. On the one side, the MPLA, which represented the best of the Angolan people, and on the other side, FNLA and UNITA. And FNLA was winning the civil war. And it is because the MPLA was winning the civil war that on October 14, 1975, South African troops invaded Angola to crush the MPLA. From the point of view of the urged by the United States, by the way, from the point of view of the apartheid regime, it made sense because Agostinho Neto, the leader of the MPLA, had made clear time and again that for the MPLA, the struggle did not end in Luanda. The struggle would end with the liberation of South Africa in Cape Town. That's the expression Neto used. Once the South Africans invaded Angola, the MPLA was not able to resist the South African onslaught. And the South Africans were advancing along the coastal road that went to Luanda. Another column was advancing in central Angola. And the South Africans would have taken Luanda and crushed the MPLA if on November 5, 1975, Fidel Castro had not decided, responding to the desperate appeals for aid of the MPLA, to send troops to Angola to fight against the South Africans. And one of the many things that is impressive about this decision of Fidel is that he took it without consulting the Soviet Union. It was a Cuban initiative, and the Cubans knew very well that the Soviet government was against it, because for the Soviet government the priority was détente with the United States, and also the relations of the Soviet government with the MPLA were difficult. So the Soviets preferred to focus on détente with. And the Cubans took a very great risk because, first of all, at that moment, there were secret negotiations underway with the United States between the Cubans and the Americans towards the establishment of diplomatic relations. It is clear that by intervening in Angola to defeat an American covert operation with the apartheid regime, these would have destroyed this talk for normalization. The Cubans sent troops to Angola knowing that they did not have the support of the Soviet Union. And for 2 months, between early November 1975 until mid-January 1976, the Cubans sent their troops to Angola without any logistic support from the Soviet Union. And for the Cubans it was a nightmare because they had old planes. And so sending the troops to Angola was difficult and complicated. And the Soviets were miffed, were annoyed, and didn't give any help until mid-January. And there was the risk that South Africa would escalate. South Africa had its military bases in northern Namibia, therefore an immense logistic advantage, and could have crushed the Cuban soldiers. Until late December 1975, the Cubans were in a situation of inferiority in Angola, both numeric in terms of the number of soldiers they were able to send and in terms of weapons. And yet they were able to stop the South African offensive. In 1978, the South African government, the apartheid regime, decided to have a secret history of the covert operation. They commissioned it to a professor, Du Toit Spies, who had access to the South African archives and was supervised by a committee that included military officers, intelligence officers, foreign ministry officers, and academics. And he wrote a study which remained classified until 1988, Operasis Havana. And in this study, he talked about the heroism of the Cuban soldiers, and he had a sentence that said more or less, the Cuban soldiers cheerfully accept death rather than surrendering. And Cuba paid an immediate price because the secret negotiations with the United States collapsed. The United States stopped the negotiations. There were West European governments that were finally willing to give Cuba some degree of economic aid, lines of credit, the West German government development aid, and all this was stopped because of the arrival of the Cuban soldiers in Angola. And over time, between January and March 1976, the Cuban soldiers pushed the South Africans out of Angola. And this was the first defeat of the apartheid regime in recent times. And the tidal wave generated by the Cuban victory in Angola washed over Southern Africa. There are two articles, to give you an example, that appeared in the South African press in mid-February 1976. One was in the Rand Daily Mail by a white South African military analyst, and he said more or less that they've won, they're winning, and they're not white. And this victory of the Cubans is going to be a terrible blow for white elitism. And the South Africans who have been there know it, because those who have defeated the South Africans are not white. And The World was the major black newspaper in South Africa at the time, and it published an editorial that said South Africa is riding the crest of a wave generated by the Cuban victory in Angola. South Africa is tasting the wine of the possibility of total liberation. Obviously, they meant non-white. So there was the moral impact of this Cuban victory, the psychological impact. There is a link, it's not the only cause, of course, but there is a link between the Cuban victory in Angola and the uprising in Soweto, because it impacted South African students in Soweto. The withdrawal of the South African army, defeated by a non-white army. Plus there was a very concrete impact, because as General Geldenhuys, who was the commander of the South African occupation forces in Namibia, wrote in his book, this was the real beginning of the Namibian struggle for liberation, because with the Cuban victory in Angola, what you have is that SWAPO gets something which is indispensable for a successful liberation struggle, and it is a safe rear guard. Because under Agostinho Neto kept his promise. He opened Angola to the liberation fighters of Namibia, to the NC, and to the ZIPRA of Zimbabwe. And it became a tripartite task. The Cubans provided most of the instructors, the Soviets the weapons, and Angola the land.
You are critical of the role played by the United States in working with and supporting South Africa's apartheid government. Tell us more about the role the U.S. played in this region during the time of the liberation struggle.
In 1975, you have a parallel covert operation, the United States and South Africa, to destroy the MPLA. And this parallel covert operation is defeated by the arrival of the Cuban troops. Then, when Carter is president, Carter kept the apartheid regime at arm's length. But Carter wanted the Cubans to withdraw their army from Angola, even though, again, the Carter administration recognized that the Cuban presence was necessary to protect Angola from South Africa. You don't have a single document of the Carter administration where they argue, well, Angola does not need Cuba, we can offer a protection against South Africa, etc. The position of the Carter administration, which maintained a large army in Western Europe against to protect Western Europe from a non-existent Soviet threat, because there was no Soviet threat by the 1977, was that Cubans have to leave Angola irregardless of the South African threat. Then when Reagan comes to power, it's different, because Reagan embraces the apartheid regime. When Pik Botha went to Washington in 1981 to establish the first contacts, Reagan became president in January 1981. When he came back, he wrote a memo for P.W. Botha saying, we have in Washington the most friendly administration towards South Africa that ever was. This is the most friendly. And the Reagan administration worked with the apartheid regime in several ways. First of all, in Angola, they both supported Savimbi. Second, the Reagan administration invented the principle of linkage. In 1978, the UN Security Council had voted with unanimity Resolution 435, which said South Africa has to allow free elections in Namibia, supervised by the United Nations. The principle of linkage, invented by the US administration, not even by South Africa, by the Reagan administration, said South Africa has no obligation to implement Resolution 435 as long as the Cuban troops remain in Angola. And of course the Cuban troops were necessary to protect the independence of Angola. As Pik Botha said eventually at a meeting of the State Security Council in 1987, since Reagan came to power, we no longer had to fear a pressure to give elections in Namibia, because linkage protected. The Reagan administration helped the South African, the apartheid regime against the ANC in several ways. One way was to apply pressure to all the neighboring countries not to allow the ANC to operate there. They apply pressure on Zambia, they apply pressure on Mozambique, they apply pressure on Botswana. De facto, the Reagan administration was an ally of the apartheid regime, and in 1986, P.W. Botha paid homage in the South African parliament to Ronald Reagan, saying that Ronald Reagan was a good friend of South Africa. There is a speech he made that I quote in my book, and indeed the apartheid regime should have made a monument to Ronald Reagan. But to give you an idea of Ronald Reagan, you are familiar, of course, with the policy of Bantustans, trying to create those small puppet quote-unquote independent states. The first one was Transkei, I think in 1977. In 1977, Ronald Reagan was out of office, but he was preparing himself for the elections of 1980, and he had a radio program. When Transkei became independent, he spoke on his radio program, and he said that South Africa had this beautiful program to give independence to the different tribes, he used the word tribes, in South Africa. And now the first of these tribes had become independent with Transkei, and this was a brave anti-communist republic, and the United States should stop being stupid and should recognize the independence of Transkei. Once he became president, he had to moderate himself. He could not, because of political pressure in the United States, but that was his position. He embraced the policy of the Bantustans, etc., etc.
After he was released from jail, former President Nelson Mandela visited Cuban president in Cuba in 1991. Can you describe this meeting between the two of the world's most iconic freedom fighters?
It was a very brave thing that Mandela did, and it was an expression of his gratitude towards Cuba, because at that time the Soviet Union had collapsed and the United States was the only superpower in the world. And to go to Cuba was already a slap to the United States, or at least to the government of the United States, to American imperial hubris. I mean, the government the Americans hated the most in 1991 was the government of Cuba. And not only Nelson Mandela went to Havana, but he made a very beautiful speech on July 26, 1991, in which he said, I'm paraphrasing and not very well, in which he talked about the immense debt of gratitude that Africa owed to Cuba, not just South Africa, Africa as a whole, and no other country had done as much as Cuba had done for the liberation of Africa. This is a very poor summary of what Nelson Mandela said, but it was very moving. And you have people now here in South Africa, because you have a lot of people who try to manipulate history and rewrite history. And for instance, you have a South African former professor at the University of Cape Town, in general a very serious person, Chris Saunders, who said that one shouldn't take these words too seriously because Nelson Mandela had a habit of saying very nice things wherever he went, which is a very dishonest statement, because it is different to go to Sweden and say beautiful things, etc. And the other thing is to go to Cuba, the country the United States hated so much, at the moment when the United States is the only superpower, and say 90 miles from the United States that no other country helped Africa as much as Cuba, and they meant that. He didn't just say, Cuba helped us, and just the fact of going to Cuba again was a slap, and saying this, which means Mandela really had understood the great debt of Africa, the gratitude that Africa had towards Cuba, which is true. What he said was exactly true.
At the memorial of former President Nelson Mandela in December 2013, the world witnessed the most iconic handshake between President Barack Obama and Cuban President. Thereafter, relations between the US and Cuba seemed to improve quite dramatically. How do you interpret this handshake and its aftermath?
Well, it was a very long overdue acknowledgement that actually, look, the truth is that President Obama, in a way, in terms of Cuba, was disappointing because he waited so long to establish diplomatic relations. And he waited so long because he took into account the domestic situation in the United States, etc. But overall, Obama is an honest man. And I think he really, if he had been able to do what he wanted, I think he would have established diplomatic relations from the first day. And I think, but that's just my impression, it's not based on anything but my opinion of Obama, that he had a degree of appreciation of Cuba, the Cuban Revolution, etc., etc. I don't think he's so ignorant not to know a certain number of positive things. And so this was a long overdue gesture on the part of Obama. The pity is that because Obama had a lot of other things to worry about, and because of the nature of the American Congress, etc. Yes, the establishment of diplomatic relations was a dramatic gesture and a beautiful gesture, and there have been some improvements, but relatively little has been done. In economic terms, the embargo essentially continues, also because a lot of the measures have been imposed by Congress, and so one needs Congress. And I don't think, although I may be wrong, that Donald Trump will break diplomatic relations with Cuba, but I think relations will remain more or less frozen where they are now.
Do you have any comment on present-day politics in South Africa and in the rest of the world?
No, I don't know enough about South Africa to have any comment, except to say, but it's a very superficial impression, that it seems to me that social reforms have not yet taken place. Again, it's a very superficial impression, the land reform, etc., etc. That Mandela, with great skill and nobility, etc., etc., began a process of political reconciliation. But the social aspect of this political reconciliation, etc., for whatever reasons that I cannot appreciate, because I don't know enough the history of South Africa, has not taken place yet. So I imagine that and I may be completely wrong, for a young non-white South African, the liberation, the end of apartheid, is a very important moment along a journey that is still going on, again in terms of social reforms and so on.